This is Second Chance with You, Baxter Boys, Book 4. Written by Jesse Gussman. Performed by J. Dice. Episode 4, Chapters 14 through 16. Chapter 14. They met the twins on the highway exit. Eve drove Riley's car, and Eden drove the car they shared. They left both cars there and piled into the back seat of Ben's pickup.
"That guy looks exactly like you, Ben,"
Eve said as they pulled into the hospital parking lot. Ben glanced over. A tall, broad-shouldered man with dark hair and eyes, wearing a black t-shirt and jeans, leaned against the building with his arms crossed over his chest and one booted foot braced against the wall behind him. It had to be one of his half-brothers. It wasn't quite like looking in the mirror, but close. The dude wasn't smiling either. "That must be the welcoming committee. They missed us last night." Ben wanted to ease the looks of consternation on his sisters' faces. This was part of the reason he'd never tried to get in touch. If his half-brothers were anything like his dad, they were mean, low-down snakes. Not people he wanted his sisters to have to deal with. Too late now.
"Should we send a delegation out to smoke a peace pipe before we all try to enter the sacred hunting grounds?"
Eden asked with a dramatic shiver. Ben eyed her in the rear view. "Why don't you just say, 'Ben, that dude looks scary. Go make sure he's not going to hurt us'?"
"Because I would sound like a 2-year-old if I said that."
"Oh, versus sounding like a 4-year-old talking about peace pipes and hunting grounds?" Riley and Eve chuckled. Eden rolled her eyes.
"I was trying to ease the tension."
Ben grabbed the latch on his pickup. He looked across the seat at Riley. "You okay for a minute?"
She nodded. "I've got a can of mace, and I'm not afraid to use it."
"Not on me, hopefully."
"I'm afraid it would be easy to get you two mixed up."
She nodded over at the man who hadn't moved but watched them with an intensity that stirred Ben's neck hairs. "Yeah." He pushed his door open. "Maybe he's just out there on a smoke break."
"And maybe he's packing. Be careful, Ben. He doesn't look like someone I'd mess with." "Don't worry, Riley."
Eden reached up and patted Riley's shoulder.
"Ben deals with guys like that all the time."
Ben got out and closed the door. He let his hands hang at his sides as he strode over. The guy straightened, watching him with the same brown eyes that stared back out at him from the bathroom mirror every morning. Ben stopped a few feet from him. The guy didn't say anything, and Ben considered waiting, but he was the oldest. He probably needed to speak first. He took his best guess. "Torque?" The guy's head jerked up. His eyes were honest and clear. Ben had worked with a lot of different kinds of men through the years, including some that were pretty shady. He'd also worked with a lot of decent, hard-working men. He'd become a fairly good judge between the two. Torque was honest and upright. Ben's heart cracked. He held out his hand. "It's good to see you, brother." Torque's eyes moved from his face to his hand and back again. Then he straightened and grabbed Ben's hand. Ben jerked him forward into a big bear hug. Torque hugged him back. They parted, but Ben kept his arm around Torque's wide shoulders. "Last time I saw you, you were about this tall and ugly as a mud fence." He held out his hand waist high. "You grew, anyway." Torque's grin revealed straight white teeth. "Better watch with the insults. You're my mirror image." "Think you got that backwards, little brother." Torque laughed. "Your wife and sisters getting out?" Ben looked back at the pickup. Riley understood and got out immediately. Eve and Eden followed. Nice-looking family. Ben's head swiveled around. It was on the tip of his tongue to tell Torque hands off, but then he realized that Torque meant it as a sincere compliment. Those are your sisters, too. They must favor your mom, especially the blonde. That's Eden, and yeah, she looks just like Mom. He ran a hand through his hair. Did one ever recover from losing one's mother? The other one's Eve. She has our dark hair, but Mom's delicate bone structure. Wow, fancy words. Guess I might have ended up like that if I'd have had sisters. Women. Ben agreed. They shook their heads together. Riley walked up and slipped her arm around his waist, like they'd been married for years instead of one day. He could have kissed her. This is my wife, Riley. She held out her hand, and Torque shook it carefully.
It's great to finally meet you,
she said. Same, Torque answered. Eve and Eden, this is your brother, Torque. They both shook his hand, eyeing him up and down. No one really seemed to know what to say. Ben was too busy trying to keep his focus anywhere but on the slim arm that encircled his waist. Finally, Torque broke the awkward silence. Come on, Graham's doing better today. After an hour and a half in the hospital room where they'd met Tuff and Turbo and their wives, Kelly and Harris, Riley was exhausted. Harris, the one redhead in the room, had the only chair, since someone had said she was pregnant. The way Turbo babied his wife gave Riley the idea that they viewed their pregnancy as a small miracle. Apparently, there were other kids, belonging to the other couples, but they'd not brought them to the hospital. The adults were enough. Several of them at a time waited in the waiting room anyway. Ben seemed to have a good time getting to know his brothers. She'd gotten separated from him, and she stood between Harris and Cassidy, who were deep in a conversation about babies, bottles, breastfeeding, and nap schedules, even though she had no clue about any of that stuff. When the nurse came in to check vitals, Cassidy walked over to talk to Torque. Riley felt a warm hand slide around her waist. You okay? Ben's deep voice asked softly. She was much better now.
I'm fine.
His arm was strong and hard and felt perfect around her. She'd taken a chance earlier when she'd walked to him and put her arm around him. There was no softness in the man, and he'd felt hot and alive under her touch. Her arm had sparked, and she wanted to move into his heat. Even now, all she could think about was his arm around her. It blocked the rational thoughts from her brain. You look exhausted, he said, like his arm wasn't driving her crazy. She tried to do the impossible and ignore it.
I'm sorry. I'll try to smile more.
I wasn't complaining. I was stating a fact. His eyes skimmed over her face again. Never mind. I'm taking you home.
But you've just met your brothers after 20 years apart, and your Graham...
He put a finger on her lips and bent his head. I'm glad about my brothers, and I love my Graham, but it's my job to take care of you. Let me do my job. Was he saying that for the benefit of any of his family who might be listening? Riley glanced covertly around. None of them were paying attention. She lifted her face. Ben's was right there. His eyes, concerned, filled her vision. The stubble on his chin called to her. A slight tug on her waist, and she moved a step closer. The rest of the world faded away, and everything was just Ben and her. His breath and hers. His heartbeat and hers. Until it all became one. I think Ben and Riley need to go home. Turbo, not quite as tall as the other brothers, but with wider shoulders and the same dark hair and eyes, came over with the same grin he'd worn all evening. Your woman looks exhausted. Although her father owned a trucking company, Riley had spent more time with the office employees than the guys outside. Ben's family was a little rougher than the businessmen and millionaires she was used to socializing with. Even though the whole "your woman" felt very caveman-like, she was sure, by the open, friendly look on Turbo's face, he didn't mean anything by it. Ben's family might be rougher, but they were also more real. Still, Riley tried to pull back. She wanted to look like Ben's wife, not his woman, but Ben's arms stayed around her like a steel band. She allowed her body to melt into his side. They faced Turbo together. "I think Turbo has a great idea. We've had a big week. You girls ready to go?" The twins came over and kissed their Gram goodbye.
"We'll be back tomorrow,"
Eve promised. Ben let go of Riley and hugged each of his brothers. Riley couldn't help but smile at the look of happiness on Graham's face. If it were possible for joy to heal, Graham would be better in no time. Finally, they were walking out of the hospital. The twins stopped to use the restroom, while Riley and Ben validated their parking ticket. "Thanks," Ben said as they waited for the twins at the exit door. He held her hand. She didn't even think about trying to pull it away. She wanted him to hold it. In fact, if he'd put his arm around her, it would be even better. As though he could read her mind, he pulled her back toward him until she leaned back against him. He tucked her head under his chin and wrapped both of his arms around her waist, never letting go of her hand. In the back of her head, warning bells were going off, but he felt so solid and strong behind her. After the crazy day she'd had, she didn't want to face reality. She relaxed back into him. His chin rested on her head. His warmth seeped through her.
"We made it through day one, I guess,"
she said. His arms squeezed, then released a little. "I thought I'd have to remind myself that I was supposed to pretend to be your husband. I'm finding it's harder to remember that I'm really not." Riley's heart stopped. His words sent shivers out her fingers and down through her toes. "Never know when someone in my family might come out behind us." Her heart froze. He'd just been holding her because of his family? Disappointment bit hard, and it stung. Before she could answer, the twins came out.
"You two ready?"
Eve asked with a look askance at their cozy position. "We are." Ben dropped his arms. He didn't grab her hand again as they all walked together to the pickup. Friday morning, Ben was up and out on the front porch before dawn. If one could get up when one never really slept. It had been amazing to be reunited with his brothers. Part of him hated the fact that he'd let fear keep him from reaching out long before this. He'd missed 20 years with 3 men he was proud to call family. Who'd have looked at his dad and thought that a man like that could have sons like Torque, Tough, and Turbo? Graham deserved a lot of that credit, he knew, since he had only been concerned about protecting his sisters. He'd done what he thought was best at the time. He'd been so focused on surviving, on paying the bills and raising his sisters after his mother died, that he hoped he could really be excused for not being able to have more than that in his life. So, sure, part of the reason he couldn't sleep was the fact that his old life had intersected with his new, and his whole family, at least all his siblings, was together at last. But that really wasn't what kept him up all night. Riley. She had felt so good in his arms, like she belonged there, like the past never happened, like she'd never paraded past him with another boy on her arm and hadn't said he was a poor boy who wouldn't amount to anything and she wasn't interested. Was she leading him on now? Was she just playing her part when her hand slid into his and her body melted against him? Were the looks she gave him under her lashes, the ones that said she admired him and was grateful, were those fake too? God knew he had enough trouble keeping his acting and his real emotions separate. Heck, there wasn't any acting on his part. Everything he'd felt for her back when he was young and dumb as dirt was all right there in his heart now. And he was stuck with her for another 6 months. There was no way he was walking away from her without ripping a part of himself out. It was going to hurt, no doubt. He wasn't sure, though, that he had what it took to put more distance between them. Everything in his heart and soul longed to be closer. He'd better enjoy this time with his family, because he was going to have to move to Antarctica to get away from the attraction he felt toward his wife and the web of lies he'd spun for himself. How could he protect his heart when the whole reason for their deal was so his family would believe they were married? For real. He stretched a hand up the banister pole and leaned against it. Sure, there were problems to solve in the shop, but they were nothing compared to the problem of his runaway feelings for Riley. The door cracked open behind him. He didn't need to turn to know it was Riley. The twins didn't make the hair on the back of his neck stand at attention. They didn't smell that good either. "Hey, wife," he said without turning around. "Hey, husband," she imitated, and he smiled. Man, he wished she didn't make him feel like the king of his castle. "As exhausted as you looked yesterday, I thought you'd sleep like a rock." "I did." She drifted over and sat down on the top step at his feet, wrapping her arms around her legs. "But I dreamed that my dad found out about us, and then all I saw was blood, and I knew it was yours." She shivered. "I didn't even try to go back to sleep." What would she do if he did what he wanted, which was to walk over, sit down on the step behind her, a leg on either side of her, and cradle her between his knees? Would she lean back into him? His heart thundered. Could he wrap his arms around her and watch the sunrise with his wife in his arms? Arms that ached to hold her. He'd put his lips on her hair and breathe deeply of her scent, allowing it to fill his lungs and his body, taking a part of her with him as he faced his day. He closed his eyes against the desire that rose like manifold heat in his chest. He shook the thoughts, but the painful longing in his body to be closer to her didn't ease. He forced himself to speak. "Your dad might be ruthless in business, but he's not going to hurt me." "He did once before." Oh, she was wrong about that. It hadn't been her dad. It had been her. Ben didn't argue. She needed comfort, so that's what he gave. "He's not going to hurt you either." "I know." She pressed back, rocking while holding her legs close to her chest. "You know how dreams can be." Did he ever? But she wasn't talking about the dreams he'd had of her. So he answered with something other than what he was feeling. "Yeah, Eden used to have night terrors. She'd wake up screaming. I didn't know what the frig to do. That's scary. For her and me." "For Eve, too, probably." "No, Eve could sleep through a bomb blast." "You know, you'd make the best dad." He didn't say anything. After Riley was finished shredding his heart, he'd kept his focus on raising his sisters. He had his mom's death to deal with, too, for him and his sisters. "You never got married." "I did 2 days ago." She harumphed. "You know what I mean." "Neither did you." "I know, but it's hard to have any kind of life working the way I do. Dad is pretty demanding. Not that he stands over my shoulder, but he wants results. Not to mention, after I got old enough, he's had me take Mom's place at a lot of charities and events." "Yeah, I guess it was the same for me. The twins took up a lot of time, and I wasn't bringing a woman home who wasn't going to love them like I did.
That was big of you. Surely you wished for help.
Every day. He willed his mouth to stay shut. He wasn't going to say that no woman compared to her, that he couldn't get the pieces of his broken heart back together, that if he couldn't have her, he didn't want anyone, that after the pain he endured with her, he would never trust anyone again anyway. The sky in front of them turned gray, then pink, then orange. He had 6 months of this, 6 months to enjoy the presence of the only woman he'd ever loved. Then he was going to leave. Chapter 15. The next week, Riley sat at her desk in her new office, which was very similar to her old one, and leaned her forehead in her hands. The headache that had been knocking on her forehead all afternoon had exploded into a pounding pain just after 5. At least it waited until everyone else went home. She grabbed some pain pills out of her purse and chugged some of the water from the bottle on her desk. She had never figured out whether there was any kind of rhyme or reason to the filing habits of her predecessor, and she'd stopped trying. The main focus now was getting all the files in order, from wherever they were. She'd gotten a good start on it last weekend when Ben had driven back to Maine to get his toolbox and make sure the house was closed up. It was funny how she'd missed him for the night he was gone. She'd especially missed sitting on the porch with him watching the sunrise. They'd done that every morning since the first morning. The thought that it was going to be hard to watch him leave for good pushed up in her head, and she shoved it back. She didn't want to think about that. Didn't want to think how she loved feeling his quiet strength and sharing her problems. With her dad, it was all about performance. With Ben, she felt like part of a team, an elite team, since Ben was so good at his job and she was decent at hers. She felt like they could take the world by storm and end up sitting at the top. Although the goal wasn't to be at the top of the world, it was just to have this terminal at the top. And with Ben, she knew she could do it. But the partnership with Ben, the feeling that they were so much stronger than the sum of their parts, was not long-term, and she needed to remember that. She should focus on how pleased her dad was going to be when this shop was on the top of the performance list. Like her thoughts had brought him up, her dad walked in her open office door. Confident as always, he strode right in, not looking surprised that she was working late. Of course not. He'd expect it. "I'm heading out on a trip for a few days," he said without greeting. "I wanted to see what you're doing first. It's been a week. You're settling in?" He walked around her desk, looking at the information on her computer screen.
It's going really good, Dad. I think in 6 months this terminal will be at the top.
Her dad crossed his arms over his chest and nodded silently, reading over her shoulder. She slid over a little to give him better access. She'd been organizing the maintenance logs. He reached down and clicked through a few places. After a few minutes of silence, he pointed to truck 7564. "The top end of this truck was redone 3 times in 6 months. The last time was 2 weeks ago. That should throw a red flag up to people in the shop. Have you been in touch with anyone about that?"
Well, it happened before we came, and I'm just now getting to these records.
"How often have you been down in the shop since you got here?" She strong-armed her smile to stay in place.
I'm there every day.
When Ben dropped her off. "Let's head down there for a few minutes now." Phrased as a suggestion, it really wasn't. She closed a few windows and shut the computer off, dread making her head feel like the inside of a church bell on Sunday morning. How would she tell her dad she'd brought Ben along with her from Maine? They walked out of her office together and headed to the shop. It wasn't a long walk. although the silence stretched between them like miles of empty desert, and the uncomfortableness of having nothing to talk to him about made each step seem like years passed. Finally, they reached the big garage bays where 4 of the 8 doors were open, and she started chattering, listing off the things that had been fixed and the plans Ben had laid out for her. Although she knew Ben wouldn't be on break, she really hoped he'd stepped out for something. The open doors let in the cool evening air. A truck sat in each bay, one with the rears out, one with the motor torn down. Ben was redoing the motor, and he told her at lunch when she called him that he'd be working on getting everything apart until after 9. As she looked, he came around the side of the hood with a piston in his hand. His face broke into a grin as he saw her, then his eyes snapped to her dad. His smile froze. She kept talking in her most businesslike tone, hoping that Ben wouldn't force any issues or make a scene. Her dad might not even recognize him, but at the very least, she wouldn't have to admit today that she'd married him. That might go over a lot better once they'd gotten the shop performing to its potential. But her dad stopped. His eyes narrowed on Ben as Ben set the piston on the makeshift work table with the rest of the motor parts. Riley altered direction, pointed away from Ben.
The shop layout is not conducive to performance. My team has some ideas that will improve production.
Her dad stopped as Ben disappeared around the side of the truck. That's the boy from Maine, isn't it?
That's Ben Baxter,
Riley said in the same tone she'd been using. Her stomach flipped and flopped like a fish on land, but she kept her face placid.
And yes, he was a part of my team in Maine, and he agreed to come down here and help with this project.
He's the one that had a thing for you back in high school. Riley tilted her head and scrunched her face like she was trying to remember.
Really, Dad? High school? I'm focused on what I did yesterday and what I'm going to do tomorrow. I'm not thinking about silly high school crushes.
Her dad turned a calculating eye on her. That's a big move to go from Maine to here. I'd watch him if I were you. Riley laughed. It sounded fake to her ears, but her dad wouldn't notice.
Ben, he loves what he does, and he's good at it.
Not what I'm talking about, girl. He'll manipulate you into giving him what he wants. His eyes narrowed. You're worth a lot. To a boy like that can barely make a mortgage on a run-down bungalow on the shady side of town, you're a cash cow. Even when she hadn't known Ben all that well, she wouldn't have thought for 1 second that he'd take something from her he hadn't earned. Her dad's words were intended to have the opposite effect, but she was more sure than ever that Ben didn't care about her money. She knew better than to argue with her dad.
He's going back to Maine when we're done here.
She turned and started off in a different direction. Instead of following, her dad walked closer to the truck Ben was working on. Riley stopped and watched with the fascinated horror one might have as they watched a car accident about to happen. How many miles were on this motor, boy? Riley cringed. Her stomach bucked and jumped. Ben's head appeared beside the turbo. Almost 1 million. When were the rods and mains done? Her dad barked another question. At 600,000, Ben answered easily. Is this a 550? It's a 6NZ. How many of these have you done? At least 100. Riley almost smiled. There, that should ease her dad's mind. But he wasn't finished. He leaned forward, and his voice lowered. Stay away from my daughter. She's your boss, and you can remember your place, or I'll remind you of it with a nice, pretty pink slip. Ben's eyes slipped to hers. She swallowed and looked away. Ben's gaze never moved from her face as he answered. Yes, sir. Of all the places in her life that she'd ever been, there was only one time and place that had been worse. Still, her mouth wouldn't open. Her brain kept saying, just 6 months. In 6 months, this will all be past. Somehow that didn't help. because even though she knew Ben was leaving, he deserved so much more than the treatment she'd just given him. Her dad moved away, and she followed. He stopped to talk to the other mechanic who was still working. He didn't know the answer to her dad's questions and had to stop working to go look them up. While her dad stood looking over his shoulder as the mechanic pulled the info up on the computer, Riley headed toward the parts room. It had been an unorganized mess when they'd come down last week, and she'd never remembered to ask Ben if he'd taken care of it. The door was unlocked, and she stepped in and flipped the light on to find neatly stacked shelves and parts clearly marked with numbers and codes. A complete difference from just 1 week ago. Someone had spent a lot of time fixing this. She made a note to thank Ben. She'd bring her dad in here just as soon as he was done grilling the other mechanic on the history of the rears in that truck. "So you didn't tell him?" Ben's voice came from the doorway. She jerked her head around, her heart cramping painfully. He held onto the doorframe with one hand, his biceps bulging, his face an unreadable mask.
No.
Riley crossed her arms over her chest, but didn't say any more because she had no excuses other than the one she'd already given him. "If you don't want to tell him, I can do it."
He doesn't need to know. We can do this without him finding out.
His hand dropped from the doorframe, and he rubbed the back of his neck. "I know this is a fake marriage and everything, but am I really such a lowlife that you're too ashamed to admit to your dad that I'm nothing more than an employee that followed you down from Maine like some stupid puppy on a leash?" She held her hands out, hating the shadow of pain that flickered across his face, hating that she was hurting the proud, strong man who stood with her every morning as the sun came up.
I'm sorry. I don't want him to know. It'll just be easier.
Easier doesn't equal better. She put her hands on her hips.
We're married right now because it was easier for you to fake a relationship than admit to your family you lied.
He looked away, a vein popping in his forehead, his fist clenched. "Yeah," he finally said. "You're right. I guess, though, when you're around my family, I don't treat you like some piece of trash stranger I barely know, lest anyone dare find out that we sit side by side on the porch of the house we share and watch the sunrise every morning." The silence roared between them. Her mouth opened, and words that she didn't want to say came out.
Fine. I shouldn't be out there with you anyway. It won't happen again.
Her heart cracked, but her voice was strong.
You need to...
Her dad's head appeared behind Ben's shoulder. Her eyes flickered to her dad, then back to Ben.
Thank you for reminding me to show this improved layout to my dad. You can go back to work now.
Ben didn't need to look at her dad to know he was there, and he gave a curt nod. "Yes, ma'am," he said before turning and walking out. Riley got the feeling her heart went with him. Ben walked into his brother Tuff's shop early Saturday morning. After having Riley act like he was barely anything more than a dirty stranger to her dad yesterday, he'd stayed at the Coleman garage until after midnight finishing the motor he'd been working on and trying not to think about why her words had hurt him so bad. He'd left the house this morning before daylight. He wasn't being fair to Riley. It wasn't part of their deal to tell her dad. And if she could get away with not telling him, it would be so much better for her. In 6 months or so, when this all blew over and he left, she'd still be here with her dad in their company. She'd have everything to deal with. Of course, her dad would probably be thrilled that she broke up with the lowly mechanic, but still, it would be a stigma for her for the rest of her life. He could ask himself over and over why he was pushing, but he knew. When she'd rejected him, she'd basically chosen her dad over Ben. Having her dad find out that she was married to him now would be a little bit of sweet satisfaction that would ease the sting of the past rejection. But that was his own satisfaction. It wasn't fair to Riley. Her treatment in the shop yesterday in front of her dad had hurt him. She'd acted like he didn't mean anything to her, like he was simply an employee and nothing more. It smarted, right in his chest, in the place that felt such peace and contentment when he had his arms wrapped around her at the hospital when they visited his gram. His brain understood perfectly why Riley acted the way she did in the shop yesterday. His heart, on the other hand, didn't understand a thing. It had always been stupid when it came to Riley. Ben shook his head. He had family to think about. The twins were thrilled to be developing relationships with the family they never knew they had. He could only support them making as many memories as possible with their gram. He had some time to make up for with his half-brothers. Torque, he suspected, was a lot like himself. Turbo, laughing and happy, was everyone's friend. Tough hadn't said much in the hospital, and other than his protective attitude over his bubbly and friendly wife, Ben hadn't been able to read him. Showing up at his garage at 5:30 on a Saturday morning was a colossally stupid idea. Tough was probably still snuggled up to his wife in bed wherever he lived. He'd probably wonder why Ben wasn't in the same position. Not that he'd want to. That was a lie, and he tried not to lie to himself. She'd acted the way she had either out of habit or because she was afraid of her dad, or maybe some of both. It didn't make it hurt less. When Ben tried Tough's shop door, it opened, and the smell of strong coffee greeted him. Lights were on, and he could hear two men talking with raised voices. He strode over to a high makeshift table where two old men sat across from each other, a checkerboard between them. They were so engrossed in their argument that they didn't notice him walk up. Tough was nowhere in sight. "Little early for an argument, isn't it?" The men stopped talking and looked at him. One had a full head of snow-white hair. The other's hair follicles had all migrated to his eyebrows. "That's not Torque," the one with hair said.
I didn't say it was,
The other said in a combative tone. "I'm Torque's brother, Ben." Ben held his hand out to the guy with hair. He stood slowly, like he needed time to get his joints working. His old gnarled hand gripped Ben's with a strength that surprised him. "I'm Al." He pumped Ben's hand a few times. "And that cantankerous old fellow is Mr. Siegel." Mr. Siegel stood in the same slow manner and took Ben's proffered hand.
I assume that you're also Tough's brother?
"Of course he is, you old coot. He said he was Torque's brother, so that means he's Tough's too."
Not necessarily,
Mr. Siegel said with a knowing nod.
Kids today do things differently. I know a family that has 5 kids, and every one of them has a different set of parents.
Al shook his head. "Tell him you're Tough's brother too," he said to Ben. "Can't you see the eyes?" "I'm Tough's brother too." Ben kept talking before the men found something else to argue about. "Where's Tough?"
He's writing his column.
Ben shoved his hands in his pockets. Column? He didn't ask because he didn't want to admit he didn't know anything at all about his brother. "He's in the office over there." Al threw his hand toward a door that was closed but not shut tight.
Maybe he doesn't want to be disturbed,
Mr. Siegel said in a simple tone, like Al was not quite all there. "Then he can say, 'I don't want to be disturbed,'" Al replied in the same tone.
But if he has to say that, then he was already disturbed.
Mr. Siegel used his black checker to jump 2 red checkers as he spoke. "Hey, wait! You can't do that!" Al pointed at the checkerboard and started explaining why that move was illegal. He threatened to get the official checkers regulation manual out. Ben hadn't realized there was such a thing. He backed away and turned toward the door. Neither man noticed, both of them trying to talk over the other, with one of them claiming he had the regulation manual memorized. It was no wonder Tough hid in his office writing a column, if that's what he had to deal with out there. Ben knocked on the door and pushed it open. Tough sat behind a computer screen, typing away. He really did have a column. Must be a mechanic advice column or something. Tough looked up. "Mind if I come in?" Ben asked. Tough waved with his hand. Ben stepped in and closed the door. He didn't have anything in mind to talk about, but the arguing could drive him bonkers. "I didn't get to talk to you much at the hospital, and I'm off today." He decided to take it off. He wasn't scheduled to work, but he would have anyway. After yesterday, Riley could save her dad's company on her own today. He'd start again on Monday. "Figured I'd come over and see if I could give you a hand. I could change a tire or something." He grinned. Tough returned his smile with a knowing one of his own, and Ben's heart warmed at sharing a mechanic joke with his brother. Their skills went much deeper. Anyone could change a tire. "What kind of column do you have?" Ben asked. Tough got a thoughtful look on his face before he answered seriously. "A relationship advice column." Ben blinked. Either Tough had the best poker face he'd ever seen, or he was dead serious. He looked dead serious. Tough indicated the chair across from him. "Sit." Ben sat. Turbo was the jokester. Ben had Tough pegged as a straight shooter, and his gut instinct was hardly ever wrong. He made the decision to go with it. "On the internet?" "I'm syndicated." That was big time. Hard to believe. Tough would be rich. Ben glanced around the small, nondescript office. "So you have a repair shop on the side?" He nodded out the door. Tough shrugged. "The column makes a lot of money, and my wife finds ways to use it to help people. The shop supports us." "You really do have a column." Ben grunted a laugh. His brother was a romantic advice columnist. "Try me," Tough said, his own lips tilting up. "Warning you, I'm going to write your answer." Ben narrowed his eyes. He'd heard of that. People who didn't talk much but who painted or played an instrument or, in Tough's case, wrote and could express themselves much better. "Fair enough." "Give me a problem," Tough demanded. "In a relationship." Ben stared at Tough, tempted to ask what he needed to do to, what, make Riley fall in love with him? Make her choose him over her dad? Make their fake marriage real? He didn't want any of that. Did he? He didn't know what he wanted, but he also wasn't sure what to do. "Make something up," Tough suggested. Yeah, because Tough thought he was happily married just like Tough was. "Okay, how about this?" How to phrase it? He rolled it over in his mind before saying, "Instead of getting married for love, a woman marries a man because the man can do something the woman needs done, and she can't do it herself. She wants to impress someone else." Tough leaned back in his office chair, his arms crossed over his chest. "Keep going." "Right." Ben leaned his forearms on his legs and clasped his hands together. "So the man agrees if the woman will do something he needs done and can't do himself. They enter their bargain, and both of them keep their ends of the deal." Tough waited. Ben stared at his hands. But one of them decides they want more. What should they do? "More what?" Ben studied his fingers like he'd never seen them before. Finally, he said softly, "More than a fake relationship." There, he'd admitted it. He didn't want a fake relationship with Riley. He wanted the real thing. That's why he was so upset that she wouldn't even acknowledge him in front of her dad. He wanted to be more than just a mechanic in her family shop. He wanted to be her everything.
This is hypothetical?
Yeah.
You sure?
Yes, Ben said firmly. For some reason, he trusted Tough, but the feelings he had for Riley had burned him badly once. It wasn't easy to put them out there, even in a hypothetical situation. Tough linked his hands together behind his head and thought for a while. Ben tried not to squirm. This was his little brother. He shouldn't feel like a school kid waiting for the principal to announce how many days of detention he had. But the same crampy feeling in his stomach, combined with sweaty palms and the intense desire to run away, was a good imitation. Finally, Tough started writing. It didn't take long. He didn't say anything, just clicked, and the printer started spitting out a paper. He pulled it off the printer and folded it.
It makes me nervous when people read my advice in front of me. Don't read it until after you leave.
Tough stood.
You still helping?
Ben stood with him. Said I would. Tough handed him the paper, and Ben folded it again and put it in his back pocket.
That's great, because I have a car on the lift with a knocking in the motor, and it's not the normal stuff.
Ben stopped with his hand on the door. Those guys stay here all day?
Yeah, you get used to them.
Ben grunted. If you say so. Chapter 16. Riley shuffled down the stairs still wearing her pajama pants. She'd been up earlier, but as she suspected, Ben hadn't been on the porch this morning, so she'd gone back to bed. After leaving the office at 9 last night, she'd gone home alone, the first time since they'd been married. Eve had informed her that Ben texted the twins and let them know he was going to be late, like midnight. Apparently, that was his standard operating procedure, texting his sisters when his schedule was interrupted. After the way she'd treated him, she didn't blame him for not texting her, and for not answering the single text she'd sent him. But she'd waited up for Ben to come home. She didn't really intend to, but she was too restless to sleep, so she tried to read in bed. It wasn't until she heard his pickup that she was able to relax. She listened to his deep voice as he spoke with Eden, who had waited up for him. Then she listened to him move in the room across the hall and heard the water in the pipes as he showered. She finally felt like she could relax, but she hadn't felt like she could face him. Her words and her actions had hurt him, and they left a bitter taste in her mouth, but she didn't know what to do about it. She did know that she didn't like herself very much, but she wasn't entirely wrong. Their deal had said nothing about her telling her dad, and Ben wasn't planning on staying once his part was over. She was under no obligation to screw up her life any more than necessary, because she was going to be dealing with the fallout when he left. Alone. Was there another way? Graham got to go home from the hospital that evening, and Riley volunteered to take her since Ben's brothers had spent more time than they had at the hospital that week. She texted Ben, letting him know she was heading into the hospital at 3 and waiting for the discharge. She was surprised when he texted back,
I'll be there.
He didn't say any more. She left the house before he got home and figured he'd show up at some point. She didn't expect him to be waiting by the main entrance. Her heart skipped several beats as her eyes landed on him. He'd either not been working or had gotten cleaned up, since his jeans were clean and there was no grease or dirt on his arms, which were folded across his chest. When she saw him, his eyes were already fixed on her. It was amazing how that look from him could make her feel like the only woman in the world. He looked at her like there was no one else he'd rather be watching. It sent warmth down the back of her neck, and her stride quickened automatically. She was still more than 5 feet away from him when she blurted out,
I'm sorry.
His arms came down, and he straightened from leaning against the front pillar. She stopped when she was directly in front of him and had to crane her neck to look into his eyes.
I really am sorry. As soon as we get your Gram settled at home, I'll tell my dad.
She hadn't realized those words were going to come out until they did, but after she said them, it felt like a dark shroud had lifted from her soul. Ben deserved to be with the woman who was proud to be beside him. She might not be his forever girl, but that didn't give her the right to give him less than he deserved. He shook his head. You don't need to, and I'm the one that needs to apologize. It was never part of our bargain for you to tell anyone that we were married. It was wrong of me to expect it. They had never signed anything when they got married. She could trust Ben to do what was right. Apparently, he felt the same way about her. But to hear him say it here, that he wasn't going to let his feelings get in the way of what they'd verbally agreed on, meant so much, especially when she knew her words and actions had really hurt him. Are we good? He asked, his brows scrunched together, his hands in his pockets.
Yes.
She jerked her head down. I'll try to do better. He pulled a hand out of his pocket and offered it to her. She took it, unwilling to get into an argument about whose fault it was that they were arguing to begin with. As always, feeling her hand sliding across his calluses, being enfolded in his dry warmth, having that protection and comfort, sent a thrill up her arm and straight to her heart. They turned together and stepped into the hospital. Ben gave his Gram her 9 p.m. pills along with a glass of water. You sure you don't want some pudding or applesauce to eat along with this? Kelly left plenty. Kelly, Tuff's wife, had been shopping while he was at Tuff's garage today. She'd stocked the fridge with more food than a classroom full of junior high boys could possibly eat, let alone one frail old woman.
No, I've had enough pudding to last me a year. I want steak.
Ben looked over the bed at Riley on the other side. He appreciated having her today. Not only had she convinced Gram she was doing her a favor by letting Ben wheel her out of the hospital, but she'd been able to get Gram to take it easy in bed rather than clean her already spotless trailer. He supposed it was his turn to try to deal with an unreasonable request. Steak? Seriously? Maybe tomorrow. That answer had always worked with the twins. Riley's mouth twitched. His Gram's lips turned down.
I'm not 3. I'm a grown woman who's more than capable of deciding for herself what she wants to eat, and I want steak.
Riley took his Gram's hand.
I'm sorry, Gram, but Kelly didn't bring steak. I actually checked the fridge because I was going to cook myself a big juicy ribeye.
She gave Gram a conspiratorial look.
Something about being in the hospital makes me crave bloody meat. It's those skinny nurses.
Gram wrinkled her nose, but she took the pudding Riley offered and shoveled a bite into her mouth. Man, how much easier it would have been to raise the twins if he'd had Riley tag-teaming him. He'd missed a wife to handle the girl problems. He'd done the best he could. It would have been easier. Riley winked at him as Gram handed back the empty pudding container. And more fun, too. He shoved those thoughts aside. That's what had gotten him into trouble yesterday, mistaking the fake marriage for a real relationship. In a fake marriage, Riley got to choose whether or not her dad knew about them. In a real relationship, he had the right to insist she tell. He handed Gram her book. I'll be in a bit to check on you.
I want bacon for breakfast,
Gram said as she turned the book toward her and opened to her bookmark. I'll keep that in mind, Ben said with another exasperated glance at Riley. She grinned and walked out ahead of him. They headed back down the trailer hallway, past the bathroom.
If I remember right, there's 2 bedrooms here.
He opened the first door and switched the light on. A shelf full of toys sat directly inside. There were a ton of stuffed animals on the bed, but no sheets and blankets.
I bet Cassidy took the blankets to wash them and didn't bring them back,
Riley said.
Kelly told me one of her twins threw up the last time she stayed.
With Graham in the hospital, they might have thought there was no rush.
He shrugged, but he suddenly became very aware of the woman beside him, the dark and her scent, her smile and her softness. His heart thumped.
Let's try this one.
He moved down the hall a couple of paces. No toys, but the bed in it was stripped too. He shut the light off and closed the door. A street light from outside shone in through the window and glowed in her hair. Her upturned face held a question, and he read something more in the parting of her lips and her quick breaths. He schooled his own features and willed his breathing to deepen and slow. He wanted to touch her cheek, slide his hand through her hair, but he hooked it around his neck instead.
I guess I'll stay here on the couch tonight, and you can head to the farmhouse.
I guess,
she said softly. Her scent, sweet and sassy, feminine and confident, swept past his nose. She leaned forward. Her hand landed on his chest.
Ben.
He put his own hand over hers, trying hard to remember it was just yesterday when he wasn't good enough for her to introduce him to her dad as her man. He swallowed, and the sound seemed loud in the silence that stretched between them.
I made Eve text me last night when you got home. I wanted to make sure that you got there okay.
His voice came out deep and soft, with jagged edges.
Should I have her do it again tonight, or will you let me know?
Her fingers curled slightly into his chest, and each pressure point burned like fire and ice. He gritted his teeth against the torture.
I've been going home by myself for years, and no one has checked up on me.
He whispered low.
I want to take care of you.
It scares me that I want to let you.
Her actions belied her words because she leaned even closer. Her tongue came out and touched her lips. He released a harsh breath at the sight. Taking his hand from his neck, he slowly slipped it behind her head, into her hair, threading his fingers through the fine strands like he'd wanted to do for days.
I can't remember anyone ever taking care of me.
Her hand slid around his chest to his back.
You can make new memories with me.
He put his other hand around her and pulled her closer until their bodies touched. If flames had erupted between them, he wouldn't have been surprised.
I can't. I'm the only one that's ever been there for me. I can't lean on you. You're not even pretending to plan to stay.
Riley, He closed his mouth. It had been on the tip of his tongue to tell her that he wanted to stay, to forget the 6-month limit, that he wanted to be with her forever. He almost groaned aloud, but she'd made it clear that she was doing what her dad wanted and what was best for the company. She doesn't want you, fool. How many times does she have to say it? He closed his eyes for a brief second before stepping back. Text me, please.
I will.
He dropped his hands, and she moved away immediately, out into the dining room, and a few seconds later, out the door. Her car started, and she was gone. He hadn't moved. He could grab a few blankets and pillows and sleep on the couch. It would be comfortable, but he wasn't going to sleep. Not for a while. Holding Riley had been even better than he'd imagined, and he'd imagined it a lot.
his hands fisted, wishing she were still under them. Was there anything he could do to change her mind? He supposed he could take 4 years and get a college degree, but he'd still be poor. He needed to be educated and rich. Walking outside, he sat on the top step of the little porch, leaning against the side of the trailer with his leg bent and his head tilted back to look at the stars. It was then that he remembered the paper Tuff had given him early that morning. He'd folded it and stuffed it into his back pocket. He'd shifted it into these jeans when he changed, then promptly forgotten about it. Did he even want to know? A cool breeze blew across the grass, and the scent of a summer evening filled him with nostalgia. His childhood had ended early, and ever since he'd been working to help his mom and raise his sisters. But, he supposed to a man like Mr. Coleman, what Ben had done with his life wasn't worth much. Ben resolved not to be sad for the years that had passed. He'd done his best, and would keep doing his best. Wasn't that the measure of a man, what he did when no one was watching? When he didn't expect a reward or accolades? No one was going to thank him for raising his sisters and doing his best for them. He'd known that when he started, and he knew it now. He wasn't going to live for what other people thought. He was going to do right, no matter who saw him, and even if no one ever noticed. Maybe that meant Riley would never be with him. As much as that thought pained him, he couldn't dismiss it. He wasn't going to quit being the best mechanic he could be, just so he could pay someone to let him spend 4 years earning a worthless piece of paper to impress Mr. Coleman. He reached into his back pocket. Working with Tuff today had impressed Ben. He was a good man, humble, with a discerning eye that didn't miss much. What would he have to say? Ben opened the paper. It crackled as he stretched it out and tilted it toward the streetlight. There wasn't much on it, just one line.
Tell Riley you love her.
Yeah, well, Tuff had seen right through his made-up story. At least he didn't have to worry about Tuff telling anyone. Hi, this is Jay, and thanks for listening. If you're ready for another great audiobook, here's one we think you might like. Or check out the playlist with all our latest releases. Don't forget to subscribe to Say with Jay, give this video a thumbs up, and tell us what you liked in the comments.